Hello everyone, Radioactive back again with another video. To be specific, MBTI Digression. This is this video is filmed on my cell phone, so as you can tell, I am on my S Pen right now. Um, I'm just simply screen recording this because I have no better way to do it. Uh, this is going to be a better explanation on cognitive functions, particularly the perception ones. Or the perceiving ones, which are the P types, which I explained in my very, very long slideshow. This consists of intuition and sensing, and more specifically, NE and I, and then SE, SI. So, the extroverted and introverted charges of these functions, and I want to go into a little bit more depth about those. Uh, if you want to explain cognitive functions the way I am right now, please go ahead, because a lot of people don't understand, especially intuition. So I'm going to start with intuition. We're going to start with NE. I feel like it's just easier to start with this, and then we go to NI. So the thing about this function is that you're going to begin at some point with in your life. All right, everyday life. You start off with one idea. Let's say you're driving down the road and there's a speed limit sign that you find, and this speed limit sign says, I don't know, 25 miles an hour. And you're like, huh, okay, 25 miles an hour. Well, what about uh, pandas? Do pandas have speed limit signs? And do pandas, like, do they know how to read numbers? So that's one thing. Okay, well, they know about numbers. What about letters? Okay, what about strawberries? Do pandas eat strawberries? Do strawberry seeds cause cancer? Um, what about, you know, strawberry seeds found in chlorine pools that cause uranium outbreak? I don't know. And, that's kind of their brain process from everything. It's going to, branch out into these insane points of data that seemingly come from nowhere. But because we aren't mystical creatures, they have to come from some conscious formation in our brain, or at least it needs to be initiated by something. So that is that trigger of whatever it is. And in fact, for me, I can say that for a brain with an any lead is typically going to have these function processes from everything they see unconsciously, so they can, they typically process things like in a crazy manner, and that's why they digress so much. Digress so much. So that's kind of what any looks like, and to make it a little simpler, I'm gonna put it into this kind of form. So you start with one point of data, and you basically just branch out, and these branch out into more, and so on. You're just gonna branch out into so many points of data that it's going to be seemingly endless, and in fact, it can be for as long as an any user lives, or anyone really, because eventually you're going to use this function enough where you just notice yourself going into crazy tangents. You're gonna have a seemingly, like, basically endless perception on things. And in fact, your secondary function, which I'm not going to explain in this video for every function, but for this case, let's say it's NEFI. Okay, so it's an INFP, and I'm an INTP, so ENTP, so I don't use FI as my secondary, but I'm just using an example because I don't want to use myself all the time. The introverted feeling would, for example, that would pick on what point of data to focus on and to choose typically as a decision. So when a EP user makes a decision, it typically relies on their secondary function. If they're stressed, usually their their tertiary or playful. Um, so yeah, okay. Anyway, so next we're gonna do NI, which is introverted intuition. This is one of my least favorite functions because of people constantly boast about how awesome and amazing their intuition is when they're introverted. Intuition and so that's kind of annoying. So let's say that they're strolling around a park, and they see a deer being hit by a man, and this man is wearing a shirt that says, I don't know, it says a lot of political statements, and there's all these points of data that are happening at the same time, and this NI user is going to process. It's not going to pick typically one and go off of it, or just go off on general, but in fact they're going to close inward. So they're going to merge these points together into uh, other points that are just like, oh my goodness, like, okay, they might branch out here and there, but they're eventually all going to close in. And I don't want to overcomplicate this, so I'll just make it simpler. And they're just going to close everything in, and it's going to look like a pyramid. You know what I mean? And everything's gonna it's gonna make sense. It's gonna tie to something, and oh goodness, look, this ties to this, and then this will tie to this, that ties to this, and boom, this is your final kind of like verdict. And that's kind of what they perceive. They perceive things closing in into what could happen in the future, and not necessarily what could possibly happen, but what is most likely to happen based on what's going on with these multiple data points. So it's going to be a really complicated process for them. In fact, more complicated than probably extroverted intuition, because of how closed in it seems and introverted it seems. With an extrovert, you can definitely ask them, how their brain works, and sometimes they can answer it. But for like an introvert, of course, they won't be able to explain it because they don't know those, what's going on in the middle. They just know the end and the beginnings. Um, anyway, next we will be talking about SE, which is a very interesting function. And in this case, they don't typically go off points of data. They go off everything. So this is going to be a lot simpler explanation because it's pretty obvious here. So extroverted sensing is let me write this a little nicer. Extroverted sensing is going to come off of a line, and this line is everything that's happening in front of them. Okay, it's going to be, what do they hear? What do they see? What do they think about that? That typically ties in with their secondary function about what they think about it. But for the most part, SE will just perceive everything that's in front of them. But they're not just going to sit there and let it absorb. They're going to have some sort of, perceiving process going on. So what they typically choose to do is they look outward. You're seeing a lot of, you know, these rays of just perception all over the outside world. And they're seeing trees, they're seeing birds, they're seeing butterflies, they're seeing houseflies, they're seeing the trash can on the side of the parking lot. Let's use another example. They're on an airplane. They can hear the airplane, the noise and everything, and they're just radiating out their perception. And there's no particular point that they're focused on. It's just everything. And everything is so outward. Everything is so external. And it doesn't stop. It just keeps going. So it's going to be like, this kind of parabola, whatever kind of shape I just drew. And it just keeps radiating outward. So that's kind of how they work. But with introverted sensing, theirs is a little bit different. In fact, it's probably a little more complicated to understand here because they see both. They, of course, know what's going on around them. They prefer concrete evidence. They prefer what they see. But they also, they don't also, they prioritize their internal senses, which is, how am I feeling? How is my body feeling? What things and do I want to get done with myself. And that's kind of like intrapersonal goals. So they're going to actually be looking inward toward themselves. And this is different than like an introverted feeling or whatever function that they have, that some people have, because they don't always look inward. But introverted sensing is a perception function. So they're going to be looking inwards. But it's not just that they look inwards. It's just that they constantly are analyzing their perception on things that they see from the outside world. So this line doesn't just come from nowhere. This line comes from the outside world, and they're going to be internally thinking and feeling about all these things, and not in a decision sense. But yes, it's because I'm explaining this in terms of like, little points here, because, okay, how does my stomach feel? How's my head? How's my thinking today? How have I slept last night? Those are kind of their main thoughts as well. But also that it concludes like structure. So they're going to be kind of closed in on these perceptions. They're going to be maybe a little bit, they're going to hide them a little bit. They're not going to communicate them as much. But external values really do push that. They really do change that. So, if they're going to see like roadkill on the road, oh no, they're going to feel pretty bad about it, especially if it's an ISFJ. They're going to have that kind of empathy feeling for seeing that, and that's going to influence on how their perception is on their internal view. They might go to bed that night and think about, okay, well, how's my day? All that stuff. I wouldn't know. That's just my theory. But yeah, it's just the perception functions, which are under the perceiving uh, letter, I guess. So that would be intuition and sensing. But I wonder how judging functions would do thinking and feeling. I've been wondering about how to put that into kind of like a drawing. I'm assuming maybe, TE and TI would be incredibly different. TE, they would organize people, right? For example, it doesn't always have to be people, but people should be organized, and there should be, a proper hierarchy. Yes, I mean, I do believe that a lot of extrovert thinkers prefer a hierarchy in some way. Do you know why? I wonder why. Because they they want to be on the top, right? Most of them do. It's incredibly common to see extrovert thinkers to be as a leadership position because of how influential they want to be on what their viewpoint on the world has been from their external, I guess, experiences and such that influence their entire logic on life, especially depending on it, whether or not that's the dominant function or not. But like for FI, I'm assuming maybe it's, an internal heart, right? You're going to think about what's going in, what's coming out, how you want to process inside of that heart. Whereas, I don't know, let's say like maybe FE would be like, hey, I'm more focused on like, how am I radiating from the inside? I don't know. So maybe I have to think about it a little bit longer to ponder about it. But yeah, that's basically, my thoughts on it. So if you have anything else on it, just let me know. All right. Peace out.